really triggered by that.
Yeah.
By the heavy breathing, so that with all the things that I've studied, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but breath work was one of them. And early on, I used to go into rehabs and run art therapy groups and breathwork groups and did some yamana body rolling. And it was my first time realizing that somebody could have, a trigger in this way. But she was like, I can't. We started it. And after like literally not even 10 seconds, she was like, I need to leave the room. And I knew what it was. But yeah, so it's interesting the amount of things around us that can trigger people. And some of us wouldn't even recognize that we're triggering somebody else or that someone else is having a trauma response. So, due to the nature of the different varieties of traumas that there are.
Yeah, and that's always been one of my concerns where you unknowingly trigger someone. And then when
Mhm.
you become aware of it, you now have a choice, right? Are you going
Right.
to change behavior or are you just going to continue doing what it is that you're doing, knowing the person's response to it? Do you then think that maybe it's a question for you, whose responsibility then should it be? Should it be on the person who's being triggered or the person who's doing the triggering? Or maybe both?
I think both. I also think it depends on the relationship and the dynamic and the situation that's happening. Like I think in a work environment where there's lots of people around and um like people I guess when someone becomes aware of it that a behavior or something that they're doing is triggering somebody, I think the most kind and humane thing is to sit down and have a conversation, and to, you know, understand. I do also I do also believe that some people who have a lot of wounding, right? Not everybody, but there's a select certain types of people with different types of personalities where they're not really interested in healing. They're not really interested in changing. In fact, they use their wounding or their things as an excuse to kind of control the situation around them. And so, that's why I said I think it depends, and there's a conversation that's kind and could be had. So,
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? Like if you want to express kindness to someone who's in a situation where they're going to need kindness and that support, I think that is something I would hope that most people would do, and I think most people would. In your situation, Brie, I know that you work with women, I believe specifically,
I
right?
work with men too. I work with men
Okay.
too. I do have more women in my private practice, and I do offer a women's group. But I'm a woman, so I can connect and create a specialized group that way. So, yeah, yeah.
What are some of the obstacles that the people that you work with find in trying to maybe overcome some of their past experiences?
Oh, that's like a Mary Poppins bag of an array of different things. I mean, from a very general sense, um, people's belief and if they believe that they're going to heal or not, I think really, really affects and impacts the trajectory. And they can unknowingly place themselves in a glass ceiling that inhibits their growth because they don't believe that it's possible, right? Or they only believe that they can get so far, right? People who believe that, um, how do I say this? It's like they believe that they will always have the trauma, right? They believe that healing's possible, but they believe that they'll always have the trauma. Now, within that statement, an array or a level of perception of what that trauma is, right? And so if they believe that, they kind of cap themselves at a certain level. I would definitely say that um, how people talk to themselves. Like if there's a absorbent amount of negative self-talk, it definitely slows the healing process down. And, some people have negative self-talk because they were very verbally abused and talked to growing up, you know, so it's something harder to work through if that's all that they've known and done to themselves, you know, or like adopted that way of self-talking inside. Um, I had another thought and I had a couple and they evaded me, but those are some of the stronger points I would say to answer your question.
I remember I was working with someone and she suffered from that where she always spoke to herself in a negative light, where she even called herself like stupid, dumb. No one will want me because I've reached a certain age. And I asked her this question. I was like, where did this start? What's the origins of this? And she was like, she doesn't know. Then I was like, okay, when was the first time either you said this to yourself or you heard it about yourself? And she was able to trace it back all the way to her childhood
Yeah.
because her parents used to say these things about her. And then as she grew up and she entered her first relationship, which ended being, she ended up married to that person, she heard it in the marriage. And there's some times where when I share this with people and I tell them that you'll be surprised what you can attract when you're attracting bad and when you're trying to figure
Mm.
it out, right? Do you then see maybe some of the men and the women that you're working with not knowing why certain trauma is happening to them, but then when you work with them, you begin to pinpoint where it originates from, and they're like, "Oh, okay, I see it now. I see why this is happening."
Um, you know, when I start working with, so I have a background in psychology and I have a pretty extensive intake form and I've studied a few different forms of trauma healing, trauma resolution work, like somatic experiencing being one of them. And in somatic experiencing, you're taught like different trauma categories. And so I usually know within the first session, but within the first couple sessions after that, if it's a little vague, I start seeing like how it's compounding. But it is really beautiful when you're working with a client and they start having those awarenesses for themselves and those like epiphanies and aha moments that kind of like starts to crack the yeah, you know, it cracks like the I don't even know what to call it, but it's like a hardened perception and neural pattern. But it's just it's a really beautiful experience to witness and be a part of. So,
So take us through that experiences. What are some of the things that you do with your clients as you're helping them through the process?
well, it depends on the client. It's a little different per person. I look at people, honestly, I look at people as like magical creatures, and like they each have their own um, aura and their own personality and their own universe that they live in and come from, right? Like they have their own history and their own tendencies towards different things. They have their own patterns of disharmony, right? So some people have a tendency towards anxiety, some people have a tendency towards depression, right? So um, I really love what I do, and I just really love people, right? And so I I get to go through a process with each person. And so depending on what's going on with them, you know, we start off with a um, you know, first session where they fill out an extensive intake form. We kind of go over things, and I am looking for their patterns of disharmony as well as their main trauma categories, because that informs the work that I do and the different methods that I choose, because before I got into trauma healing, I was doing like soul healing and energy healing and art therapy. And so parts of that still comes into the work today, just depends on what's going on with them. So depending on that, we create kind of a loose treatment plan. And I um, oftentimes when people come in, you know, a lot of people come in their later 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they come in after an event that kind of reopened and reactivated a lot of the trauma that they experienced earlier in their life. And by this point, they've experienced other little traumas, other stresses in life. And so it's like compounding them. Um, so one of the things that I do actually that I tend to do in the beginning is an emotional impact release. It came from it came from my earlier era doing energy healing, and it's really, really profound. It's really effective, and so that uplifts a lot of the emotional intensity that people are feeling, and so it makes life easier for them, but it makes the treatment and their healing graceful and swifter. So after that, I start moving into, and sometimes we do the somatic work, the trauma resolution work in between, or in the middle, and then do some of those sessions. But yeah, so it's a lot of body-based somatic work after that that helps resolve trauma. And I don't know if you mean more specifically about what that is, but because it looks different, I think, per somatic experiencing or per trauma resolution or per person who does somatic healing work. So, like if you give me I'm a very specific person. If you give me like a context, like with boundaries or with this, I can give you something more concrete and tangible.
Absolutely. So I'll give you an example. So if I was someone that came to you and I was going through bad relationship after bad relationship, and I was like, Brie, you know what? I'm just the type of woman that I'm dating. It's, you know what, they're attractive, but they just seem to not gel with what I'm looking for. And I'm trying to understand what is it that I may be lacking when it comes to my relationship, or maybe I'm not communicating it properly to these people. So if I were to come to you and say that I think it's a communication issue because I'm not able to verbalize what I want or what my expectations are in a relationship, what would you say to that?
Well, I would ask you a bunch of questions because at right now, like if you were a client, I don't know where to go because I don't have enough information. So like what pops up in my mind is your perception of your communication skills accurate, right? Or do you actually communicate well and you're thinking that it's communication skills, right? I'm curious about the pattern of person. Like, do you have a pattern of a person that you continue to date, right? I'm wondering what your self-worth is, right? I'm also wondering, I'm wondering, like, what it is that you're really wanting in a relationship. Like, are you really wanting intimacy and you don't know how to create that and you've never really experienced that in your life? You know, so those are all the thoughts that run through my mind when I hear you. So, usually I think that when there's a relationship, usually when we continue to date the same person over and over again, right? Like the same type of person or create the same relationship dynamics going on. There's usually wounding that occurred in childhood, and or can be templated from the very first person that we dated, that we had that we had a romantic relationship with. But usually it's childhood dynamics and needs not being met, right? So I'm looking at, so that's the big underlay of what we'd be looking at. So,
I agree with the self-worth because I think sometimes people undervalue themselves, or worse yet, they allow someone to maybe take advantage of them, right? So, for example, you can have someone who's in a relationship, and as you mentioned, right, what is the pattern? Well, I'm dating someone that is always using me for my money, for my time, and then their contribution doesn't meet my expectations, but I'm thinking I'm communicating it well,
mhm.
but the person isn't receiving it in the way that I'm communicating it. So what happens is I make a choice now. Either I can remove myself from this person unhealed and just continue along doing the same thing over and over again, or I can take a step back and say, you know what? I need to identify inside myself what is going on, to your point, right? Like trace it back. Is it that I wanted to be worthy of my parents' approval and I worked my ass off, I did well in school, and I didn't get it?
Mhm.
Or did they break me down and say that no matter what accomplishments that I have, that I did do, I didn't get any positive reinforcement? Would that be along the lines of what we're discussing?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So when you then get the people and you want to have them and you want to drill down and you want to take it from there, because I know for me, I do what I do a lot of times because of what I went through,
Mhm.
right? And how I said that, and we talked about this earlier, right? Like, oh, I wish I had a terrain back then. I wish there was a brie back then, right? So when
Yeah.
you're working with your clients, what inspired you or what got you to the point where you wanted to work with them and why?
My healing journey started when I was 12. I read my very first healing book. It was a book by Deepak Chopra. It was more a spiritual healing book. But I would say because of the nature of the trauma that I endured and what I went through, um, I'll just tell you a little bit briefly. I was born with bilateral hip dysplasia, and my hips were dislocated, which means your hips are dislocated at birth. And the doctors didn't catch it. So I walked for 2.5 years with them in the wrong spot. And so the socket that the leg bone goes into wasn't formed. So when they finally found out what it was, they had to do surgeries to create a socket on both sides. And I was so far developed that my body had a hard time. So I had my first surgery when I was 3.5. I had my 10th surgery when I was 11. And in that span of time, I spent almost 6 years in a body cast, like in and out of a body cast, but if you add the time up. So I had a very, very unusual and very different childhood. And I felt a lot of shame and I felt like I didn't fit in. And I mean, I didn't. I wasn't outside running around with other kids, and I was made fun of a lot at school. And I had a lot of depression and sadness and a lot of identity issues and body image issues. And so I I think just the type of heart that I have, I've always wanted to help people. So from the gate, I studied, psychology out of school and figured out if I wanted to be a psychotherapist or something else. But I feel like I got off topic from what your question was. But so I wanted to heal, and I knew that as I healed, my path would become more clear of what I was how I could be healing people. Because at a certain point, I figured out being a psychotherapist or a marriage and family therapist wasn't the best course for me. Um, and mainly because when I went to therapists in my teenage years and early 20s, talking about what was going on wasn't resolving the trauma that was held inside of my body because of I'm a very body-based trauma category, right? I had attacks on my body over and over. So it creates different symptoms. So I knew that wasn't it. So yeah, so that was that was what how I figured it out was I knew that I was here for a reason because like most people don't go through this. And I just felt like God had me here going through this and that it was going to pay off somehow as I healed and I would become more clear on what that looked like. So,
When you look back on that experience that you just shared, did you ever think you would end up in the situation that you're in now, helping people in the way that maybe you wanted to be helped as well?
not clearly. I think I knew that I would be helping people. I just didn't know. And I mean, I didn't know for many years. I was like really confused. And part of it was I had my own identity issues because of the way that the world treated me, like I felt like I was not just like crippled, but like I was mentally retarded or something because I was in a wheelchair for a lot of times, you know? So being young, you kind of you don't really you just take on imprints of society. But I would say it wasn't until I was in my early 30s that I was like, I knew that I was going to be doing trauma and working with people with trauma. And then I would say my mid to later 30s, I recognized more clearly the types of people because I had worked through my trauma. So it became clear to me what my kind of special offering was and the type of people that I would be most aligned with. So,
I asked that question because when I decided to heal myself, one of the first things I had to do was have a very honest conversation with myself.
mhm.
And part of that honest conversation is that I said, these are the things that I can control. These are the things that I can't control. These are the things that are my responsibility and I'm causing. And these are the things that aren't my responsibility and I can't, that I'm not causing. And I think what that did for me was that I began to realize how much of my pain and suffering was actually my fault. I was allowing people to do certain things to me that I didn't like, but to an earlier point, I may not have been communicating that I didn't like it, or I wasn't even communicating at all. I'll just let it be, right? But then when I found the courage to say something, it kind of caught people off guard because now you're confronting the issue after so many months, maybe so many years of not confronting it. When you're in your maybe personal experience or even the clients that you work with, is there some difficulty confronting some of the behaviors that maybe not only that they're doing, but maybe what other people are doing around them?
It depends on the client. You know, some clients come in and they are so raw and real and authentic, and they're like, I did it again, you know, and I hate that I'm doing this, but I can't help it, you know, and it's beautiful when they do that. And those who do that, they heal faster. You know, they heal faster. And some clients it's hard. You know, there's a few clients where they get massively defensive, you know, and so it's how do you work with that, you know? And so some personalities handle feedback better. Some personalities are, and some don't, you know, some get really, really triggered. But I think where people are along their healing journey, whether they're the beginning, the middle, the end, um, you know, in the beginning, like people are more, they're not as aware of their part in things. You know, they're not as aware. They're aware of their emotions. They're aware of how they're feeling. They're aware of kind of what's happening, but not like really, really aware. And so as you continue on, you become more aware. Um, but yeah, I love that you brought that up about you having that real hard conversation with yourself. I also have a moment of that where I had a real hard conversation for myself along my healing journey, but it was like midway through, because I was getting to the core of what I had so much shit. I had like right after my surgeries, my parents divorced and I was put in the middle and da 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 da. And I have like sexual trauma in there and got into drugs. I had my daughter at 19, which helped get me on track, right? But I'd worked through a lot of like the outer layers. And as I was getting to the core, I had a moment where I was like, I'm the common denominator here. Like, I got to take a look at this because it's just like this is ugly and I don't want to look at it, but I have to because if I don't, I'm going to keep feeling the way that I'm feeling and continue to have the same experiences. So I think that that's a very important part along people's healing journey is that conversation that they have with themselves.
Do you think everyone has that conversation with themselves?
Gosh, I sure hope so, but probably not. Probably not, to be real here. I don't think everybody does, you know? But I think that when people really, really, um, yeah, I think that the people who really transform and really take their healing seriously and put it front and center in their life. Um, I mean, one, they have to because there's like no other choice, right? Like life is so painful for them. Um, but yeah, those people that do, and other people. There's a lot of people that like to point the finger and blame other people and not see their part in it, you know? So,
I have someone I used to have a friend that was like that, where instead of confronting the issue, which he was maybe causing or maybe he was experiencing, he'd become aggressive, he'd become angry. And as a lot of people would say that, or a lot of people, well, I guess a lot of people maybe don't know, but what some people will say is that anger is is a secondary
mhm,
emotion, right? Like it
yeah.
leads to something else. And what would happen in his case is that he would get mad over things that when you think about it is like an insecurity. So instead of confronting what is making him insecure, he wants to attack
Mhm,
the people that are maybe becoming aware of the insecurity. So he doesn't ever have to deal with it, because if he ignores it and if he attacks people and removes them, no one is ever going to bring it up. And actually, one thing I connected back to that situation is that if you're not it's hard to trust someone who isn't honest enough with themselves to say that I need to fix this, I need to fix that. Because we're not perfect creatures, right? We're all growing and we're all hopefully evolving into something else. But if someone says that, okay, Brie, at the age of 20, I'm perfect, I don't need to change anything. Like,
a
you still have
20-year-old
like,
would say that though.
well, the 20-year-old would say that, right? Like, you still have 65 more years. Like,
Yeah.
you don't even know what you don't know.
Yeah, totally.
Right? Like, isn't that kind of crazy how some people can maybe be arrogant in their ignorance, or maybe they can use their ignorance as a shield to protect the breeze from the world, the trains from the world, from getting too close. Because if you get close enough and you bring out what I'm sensitive about, what I'm insecure about, then I can't have that and I need to remove you. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that it's a very real thing. I think that a lot of insecurities, people who have a lot of insecurities or shame, mo- so they talk about like stages of healing, right? And one of the first stages is denial, like the first stage is denial, right? Like not knowing that you're needing to heal. Um, and so they might be aware, they might be in denial or they might be aware. And that's just how some people manage. That's how they do life, and that's how they engage. And they're, for the most part, um, I mean, I believe that humans in general, I want to believe everybody, but I don't believe everybody, but almost everybody is good-hearted and good-natured, right? Um, I wish I could say everybody, but I don't. I don't think it's everybody. Most everybody. And so, I think that some people, they're just unconscious of how they are, and how some of their behaviors are. Like there's a whole sect of psychology that talks about our unconscious. It's a Jungian style of psychology. So, yeah.
How do you think that that type of person then would impact their relationships, whether it's romantic or friendship?
So people who are more unconscious or unaware or rigid in their ability to change or see themselves, how they would affect their relationships, I mean, is they become hardened in a certain way. And it has, depending on the type of person that they've partnered with, I mean, it can be injuring to the partner, or the partner the partner could be very strong and not allow it to bother them, and the partner could love that person through it, and the other person could heal, right? But that's usually not what happens. What usually happens is that is that people end up it ends up making the other person, it shrinks them down, right? It dims them down. And oftentimes, if it's a person that has a tendency towards codependent behavior, they're going to start taking it on and believing that the issue is them, right? And maybe on some level, they know that it's not, but on another level, they're going to feel like it is and start operating and making choices to tiptoe around, not to bring this up, you know? And so then they don't get to really shine and be who they are in the relationship. And so intimacy wedges itself apart and there's more ruptures in the relationship. So instead of there being a nice, unified harmony between the two, it's a ruptured and it gets more and more divided. And again, you know, that's an overview, but depending on the person, it can affect them in more unpleasant, adverse ways.
And then my concern for that person who's in a relationship with someone like that is that if they continue to give, to your point, if they continue to tiptoe around it and maybe ignore it, and then in turn ignore their feelings because they're probably being hurt by it, if that relationship were to end and they're the ones who end up getting dumped, they're going to feel a sense of like, I'm discarded. I gave all of this. I tried to make it work. And then when they get into their next relationship, that's why I feel bad because they're bringing in unhealed trauma. And as you mentioned, there's a codependency. They're going from that where they gave so much, got back so little. Now they're in a new relationship. I don't see them giving as much, which is unfair to the new person that enters.
No, true. Sometimes people want to try harder than they did the time before. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're more jaded, right? It depends on their own makeup, you know, of their own personality and their own unique traits to them. But you know, with time though, it does erode. I believe it does erode people when they have, you know, one or two experiences, they might still feel like the next one I can do it. But if they're on like four or five or six, I would agree with you that they can become jaded and just like waiting for the other shoe to drop or like, you know, letting go of their dreams and desires of, you know, or suppressing them of like wanting marriage or whatever, you know, wanting to build a beautiful little family. So I think, yeah, people can, I agree.
How would someone then, to your point, right, make sure that they don't become jaded, that they tackle it head on and make sure that they're not only protecting themselves and benefiting themselves, but they can still have what they look for in a relationship?
I mean, honestly, if somebody is continuing to date and recreate the same dynamics in a relationship, just a different person over and over again, I feel like they need a relationship vacation. They need a pause. They need to not date. And you know, usually like I said before, there's unmet needs, you know, and there's like a little child inside of them that's hurt and wounded and desperately desiring love or attention. But if that need can get met without a relationship, right? In friendships, or if they can go to therapy and work on things in with a therapist, a coach, a practitioner, right? Um, and they have time to grow on their own in between a relationship, their likelihood of picking a healthier relationship is a lot higher after because there's healing that needs to happen inside of them. There's, you know, if usually in those types of dysfunctional relationships, there's codependence. So if they can come back into their own independent self, right? Um, and just the growth that can happen helps people, right? And maybe there's other skills that they need to work on, like boundaries, right? Maybe identifying like how they continue to recreate the same relationship and what are the things that they tend to slip away or let go of, right, within themselves, or they agree to that they shouldn't really be agreeing to, right? So kind of fortifying themselves and getting stronger again, and becoming aware of how they're recreating those patterns sets them up for success to, you know, not do it again.
And Brie, as we close, give us some tips on how we can create healthy boundaries in all areas of our life.
You can't ask me to close with such a broad question.
All right, I'll be specific then. Create
Okay.
boundaries that can help us to overcome a bad past experience, such as what we just described, right? Like I'm going through a relationship where I'm emotionally unavailable because I've been mistreated on an emotional level, and I want to create boundaries so I can have healthy emotional attachment to my next partner.
So how to work on this in between, you mean? So, well, let me just understand you properly. So you're emotionally unavailable or you're emotionally shut down. So when you go into relationships because you've been doing this over and over again, you're more guarded in your heart. Okay, so you're too boundaried then, like too guarded, right? So there's no boundaries and then there's like walls, concrete cement walls, right? So there's two different things, right? So there's poor, weak, flimsy boundaries or none at all in certain moments, and then like prison cell boundaries. So for somebody who has prison cell boundaries and they're hardened, um, with for good reason, right? To self-protect themselves. Um, I, when it comes to relational boundaries, healing occurs in relationship, right? So you can do written journal exercises, you can identify what the patterns are. But for this person, I would recommend two things. First, I would have them um, look at what needs to be in place in a relationship for them to soften that boundary, right? For them to feel a little bit more relaxed in engaging with them and safer to open up on an emotional level, right? So maybe they need to see consistency, right? In a particular way. Maybe they need to be with somebody that's, I don't know, financially stable, or because that could be part of their past, right? Maybe they need to see someone who's kind over and over and over again. Maybe they need to see how somebody is with anger, right? Like how do they do anger? Like do they explode or not, right? So I think people who are like that, they need to figure out what they need to be shown in a relationship that can make them soften and open their heart. The other thing is to actually practice, not with a partner, but with other people, opening up and being vulnerable with safe, healthy friends, or family members, so that they can re-experience or relearn what it feels like to be open and emotionally connected with somebody who's safe, so that their body, their being, their nervous system remembers and can feel what that's like. That will help them. So that's my answer.